The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic hammer, pounding the value out of a man's life, piece by piece. I stood at the back of the crowd, my arms crossed over my chest, the flannel of my shirt worn thin at the elbows. It was a cold day for late October in Iowa, the wind carrying the scent of turned earth and the ghosts of summer corn. This wasn't just any auction, this was the Miller place. Tom Miller had been my dad's best friend. Now his legacy was being sold off to the highest bidder, his widow standing pale and small by the farmhouse porch, looking at nothing. Lot after lot went under the gavel, a rusty New Holland haybine, a set of worn-out disc harrows, the family's Ford pickup with a dent in the passenger door I remembered Tom putting there himself 10 years ago. Each sale was a nail in the coffin of a life I understood. My own farm, the Callahan place, was just over the rise. A half-section, free and clear, paid for by my grandfather's sweat and my father's stubbornness. A legacy I was terrified of losing. Then came the big iron. Tom's John Deere 4430, a good tractor, clean and well kept. The bidding started fast. I watched Earl Peterson's hand shoot up again and again. Earl was the new kind of farmer. He farmed with a pen and a bank loan more than he did with a wrench and his own 2 hands. He'd bought the old Henderson place 2 years back, and now it was clear he was aiming to swallow the Miller farm whole. He stood there in a clean seed corn cap and a new Carhartt jacket that hadn't seen a day of real work, a smug little smile playing on his lips. The 4430 went to him. Then the planter, then the land itself, all 320 acres. The auctioneer's final sold echoed across the yard, and a quiet sickness settled in my gut. It was over. Another family farm absorbed into a bigger operation, another neighbor gone. As the crowd started to break up, Earl swaggered over, his new cowboy boots crunching on the gravel driveway. He clapped me on the shoulder, a little too hard. "Tough day to see, huh, Jack?" he said, though there wasn't a lick of sympathy in his voice. "But that's progress. Get big or get out, they say." I just nodded, my jaw tight. Tom was a good man, a good farmer. He was, Earl agreed, pulling a pack of Marlboros from his jacket. But he was stuck in the past, trying to make a living with that old junk. He gestured with his chin toward my truck, a '68 Chevy C10, its blue paint faded to the color of a washed-out sky. "You can't compete in the '70s with equipment from the '50s, Jack. The bank knows that. That's why I got the loan and Tom got the auction block." He lit his cigarette, the smoke pluming in the cold air. His eyes drifted over to the far end of my property, where the roof of my machine shed was just visible. He knew what was in there. My dad's Farmall M, a '49 model that still started on the second crank. My John Deere 4020, a workhorse from '66 that I knew every bolt and gasket on. And my combine, a John Deere 7700 Turbo, bought used 10 years ago. It was old, but it was mine. Every piece of it, paid in full. "You're still running that old 7700, aren't you?" Earl asked, a condescending smirk spreading across his face. "Heard you had to patch the grain tank again last year. You know, I just took delivery on a brand new Gleaner N6. Air-conditioned cab, hydrostatic drive, grain monitor. It'll cut twice the acres in half the time. You ought to come see a real machine work sometime." "My 7700 gets the crop in," I said, my voice low and flat. "And it doesn't send a payment to the bank in Des Moines every month." Earl laughed, a short, sharp bark. "You can't save your way to prosperity, Callahan. The game has changed. Inflation's running 10%. This land I just bought will be worth double in 5 years. The loans are practically free money. You're sitting here with your paid-for junk, and you're not growing. In this business, if you're not growing, you're dying. You're just too stubborn to see it." He flicked his cigarette onto the gravel, grinding it out under his boot. "Well, I've got to go sign the papers." "Good seeing you, Jack. Try not to fall too far behind." He walked away, leaving me standing there with the cold wind and the bitter taste of his words in my mouth. I watched him go, the embodiment of everything that was changing in the world I knew. He was all confidence and credit, betting the farm on tomorrow's prices. I was all caution and calluses, holding on to what was already mine. He called it dying. My dad called it staying free. As I drove home, the setting sun glinting off the corn stubble, Earl's words echoed in my head. Get big or get out. It was the new gospel, preached by bankers and university extension agents. But my gut, the same gut that told me when the rain was coming or when a bearing was about to go, told me that debt was a chain. And I'd seen too many good men get tangled in it. Now, before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you something. Take a moment and think about it, and let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Who do you think had it right back then? Was it the guy like Earl, leveraging the bank's money to expand and chase the big profits, betting on the future? Or was it the man like Jack, who believed in owning his iron, staying out of debt, and weathering the storms by staying small and independent? It's a question that defined a generation of farmers, and the answer wasn't as simple as it seemed. The next 2 years were a blur of hard work and quiet worry. The winters were for maintenance. I'd spend weeks in the frigid machine shed, the air thick with the smell of penetrating oil and the hiss of the propane heater. I tore the 4020's engine down to the block 1 year, replacing the piston sleeves and rings myself, meticulously setting the torque on every head bolt. I knew that tractor better than I knew the back of my own hand. When I was done, it ran smoother than the day it left the factory in Waterloo. Earl, on the other hand, just called the dealer. I'd see the service truck rolling down his lane, a young mechanic in clean overalls hopping out to plug in a diagnostic tool. Earl would stand there, hands in his pockets, then write a check for a sum that would have made my father faint. He bought another 160 acres from a widow who was moving to town. His operation was a sprawling empire now, stretching across the county. He had 2 new gleaners, a 4-wheel drive Steiger that looked like a monster from a science fiction movie, and a line of credit that was the talk of the coffee shop. The talk about me was different. Poor Jack Callahan, they'd say. His dad was a smart man, but Jack's just afraid. Can't see the opportunity right in front of him. I heard the whispers. I saw the pitying looks. My wife, Sarah, heard them too. She never said a word against me, but I could see the worry in her eyes when she paid the bills, the slight furrow in her brow when we'd see Earl and his wife drive by in their new Lincoln Continental. My breaking point came during the soybean harvest of '79. The season had been wet, the ground was soft, and the beans were leaning bad. I was pushing the old 7700 hard, the 6-cylinder diesel roaring, the cab rattling around me. I was halfway through the back 80, the field furthest from the road, when I heard it. A sound no farmer ever wants to hear. It wasn't a squeal or a grind, it was a deep, catastrophic bang, like a shotgun going off inside a steel drum, followed by a violent shudder that shook the whole machine. The engine died instantly. A thick black plume of smoke billowed from the side panels. I knew before I even shut the key off. I had thrown a rod. The block was likely cracked. The crankshaft was probably a piece of scrap metal. The heart of my harvest was dead. I sat there for a long time, the sudden silence deafening. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and the rustle of the wind through the unharvested beans. I climbed down, my legs feeling weak. I pulled the side panel off. Oil, thick and black, was dripping from a fist-sized hole in the side of the engine block. It was catastrophic. A complete rebuild was out of the question. It would cost more than the whole combine was worth. A used engine, if I could even find one, would be thousands of dollars I didn't have. I walked the 2 miles home, each step feeling heavier than the last. I felt like a failure. Earl's words, dying, echoed in my ears. Sarah met me at the door, her face pale. She'd heard the silence. The next few days were the darkest I'd known. I called salvage yards. Nothing. I talked to the John Deere dealer. The parts man just shook his head and tried to sell me on their new line of combines, with financing at a very competitive rate. I felt the walls closing in. Half my beans were still in the field, and a wet forecast was on the way. That's when I remembered Old Man Hemmings's place. It wasn't a salvage yard, not officially. It was more like a graveyard, a sprawling, overgrown field where farm equipment went to die. Hemmings was a cantankerous old bachelor who hadn't farmed in 20 years. He just collected junk, dragging it home from auctions and scrap heaps. People said he was crazy. I drove over there the next morning, my stomach in knots. The place was a maze of rusting iron, old tractors, plows, combines, all slowly being consumed by weeds and weather. I found Hemmings by a lean-to, trying to get a spark out of an old Maytag washing machine engine. "What do you want, Callahan?" he grunted, not looking up. "I need an engine, Mr. Hemmings, for a John Deere 7700. He finally looked at me, his eyes sharp and clear in his wrinkled face. "Ain't got one. Not that'll run." He spat a stream of tobacco juice. "But I might have something better." He led me through the iron labyrinth, past forgotten farmals and skeletal corn pickers. We came to a clearing at the far back of the property, and there it sat. It was a monster, a Massey Ferguson 760, one of the biggest combines of its day, now a forgotten titan of rust. It was huge, far bigger than my 7700, with a massive grain head half swallowed by prairie grass. The red paint was faded to a dull orange, streaked with black from years of sitting. A tree was growing up through the unloading auger. "She's been sitting here for 10 years, Hemmings said. "Came from a big outfit up north that went bust. The Perkins V8 in her was supposed to be strong, but they had transmission trouble and just parked it." I walked around it, my heart sinking. It was a wreck. The tires were flat and cracked, the cab glass was shattered, and birds had built nests in the engine compartment. But as I looked closer, I saw things. The sheet metal was thick, not like the flimsy stuff on the new machines. The frame was heavy-duty. It was built like a tank. "What about the engine?" I asked. "Perkins 540, 8 cylinders of British Thunder," he said with a hint of a smile. "It turned over when they brought it in. Can't say about now, but it's all there." I spent an hour looking it over. I pulled the dipstick. The oil was black and thick, but there was no water in it. I put a wrench on the crankshaft pulley. With all my strength, I could just barely move it. The engine wasn't seized. It was a long shot, a crazy, desperate, impossible long shot. "How much?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Hemmings looked at the derelict machine, then back at me. He saw the desperation in my eyes. "You haul it, it's yours for scrap price, $500. I didn't have $500. I had $300 in the coffee can in the kitchen. I told him as much. He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Bring me the $300. And a bottle of that whiskey your dad used to like. We'll call it even." Getting it home was an ordeal in itself. I had to hire a flatbed, and we spent a whole day with chains, winches, and cutting torches just to free it from the earth's grip. When we finally dragged it into my yard, it looked even worse than it had in the junkyard. It was a monument to failure. Sarah came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the rusting hulk, then at me. She didn't say a word. She just put her hand on my arm, her touch telling me everything I needed to know. She was with me, no matter how crazy this seemed. That night, Earl Peterson drove by. He slowed his shiny new truck to a crawl, staring at the Massey Ferguson sitting in my yard. I was outside, starting to assess the damage. He rolled down his window. "Good God, Callahan, what is that thing?" he yelled across the lawn. "My next combine," I said, my voice defiant. He stared for a second, then he threw his head back and laughed, a loud, booming laugh that echoed in the twilight. "You finally lost it. You're going to bet your farm on a piece of junk from Hemmings' graveyard. You're a bigger fool than I thought." He shook his head, still chuckling, and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust behind. His laughter stung, but it also lit a fire in me. Fool was I? We would see. That night, under the cold glare of a single bulb in my machine shed, the real work began. I was no longer just trying to save a harvest. I was fighting for my pride, for my family's name, for the very idea that a man could still make his own way with his own two hands. The next few years were defined by the smell of diesel and the feel of cold steel. The early 70s were booming. Nixon had opened up trade with Russia, and the Great Grain Robbery, as they called it, sent prices soaring. Corn was $3 a bushel, then $4. Soybeans were hitting numbers nobody had ever dreamed of. The government was telling us to plant fence row to fence row, and Earl Peterson was taking that advice to heart. He was a king in his own kingdom. Every time you turned around, he was breaking ground on a new grain bin or pouring concrete for a new machine shed. He traded his 2-year-old gleaners for 2 brand-new John Deere 7720s, the biggest and best you could buy. He bought the old Schmidt farm, adding another 200 acres to his empire. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres, all of it leveraged to the hilt. At the coffee shop, he'd hold court, talking about depreciation schedules and tax write-offs. He'd talk about land values like they were a law of nature, something that could only ever go up. "It's a new era," he'd proclaim, slapping the counter for emphasis. "The small timer is a thing of the past. You've got to be big, efficient. You've got to spend money to make money." And when he said small timer, everyone knew he was talking about me. While Earl was signing loan papers, I was covered in grease. That Massey Ferguson, which I'd nicknamed the Beast, became my obsession. The first winter was spent on the engine. The Perkins V8 was a marvel of engineering, but it had been sitting for a decade. I drained the sludge that passed for oil, pulled the heads, and spent a week cleaning carbon off the pistons and valves. I had to fabricate a new fuel line out of copper tubing. The injectors were clogged solid. I cleaned each one by hand with a tiny wire and a can of carburetor cleaner until they sprayed a perfect mist again. I rewired the entire electrical system, tracing each brittle wire back to the source, replacing it with new, heavier gauge wire, soldering every connection, and sealing it with heat-shrink tubing. Parts were a nightmare. The local Massey dealer just laughed when I asked for parts for a 760. So I became a scavenger. I drove to farm auctions 2 states away, not to buy tractors, but to rummage through boxes of old parts, looking for a matching fuel pump or a gasket kit. I found a burned-out 760 in a salvage yard in Nebraska and spent 2 days stripping it for anything I could use. Hydraulic pumps, belts, and a few precious pieces of cab glass. My own fields became a secondary concern. I got my crops in with the 4020 and my old 4-row planter. But I was always rushing, always thinking about the project waiting in the shed. I hired a neighbor to combine my beans that first year, paying him with a share of the crop. It felt like a defeat, handing over that money, but I had no choice. The community watched me with a mixture of pity and scorn. Men would stop by, lean against the door of the shed, and watch me work. "You know, Jack," one of them said, shaking his head, "you could get a loan for a good used machine for what you're spending in time on this thing." "Time is the one thing I have that's paid for," I'd grunt back, not looking up from the hydrostatic transmission I was rebuilding. But I was making progress. In the spring of '80, after a winter of non-stop work, I was ready to try and start it. I filled the massive radiator with fresh coolant and the crankcase with 30 quarts of new Rotella. I bled the fuel system, cracking each injector line until pure, clean diesel dripped out. I hooked up 2 heavy-duty truck batteries. I climbed into the dusty cab, the seat cushion cracked and faded. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of old vinyl and fresh grease. I turned the key. The starter groaned, a low, tired sound. It turned the big V8 over once, then twice. It felt agonizingly slow. I thought of Earl's new Deers, starting with the flick of a key. I thought of the laughter. I pushed the ether button on the dash for just a second, giving it a little taste. I turned the key again. The engine spun, coughed, and then, with a volcanic eruption of black smoke from the straight pipe exhaust, it roared to life. It wasn't a smooth hum like a new machine. It was a deep, guttural, earth-shaking roar. The whole shed seemed to vibrate. The ground shook under my feet. It was the sound of a sleeping giant waking up. A grin split my face, the first real grin I'd had in a year. It ran. It actually ran. Getting the rest of it working was another year of struggle. The hydrostatic drive was weak, the unloading auger was bent, and half the belts were dry-rotted. I fixed it all, one piece at a time. I taught myself to weld so I could patch the holes in the grain tank. I learned more about hydraulic systems than I ever wanted to know. The combine became a patchwork quilt of ingenuity. The unloading auger I straightened with a chain, a hydraulic jack, and the biggest oak tree in my grove. The paint was a mismatched collection of Massey red, John Deere green from a fender I'd scavenged, and rust-colored primer. It was ugly. It was loud. But it was mine. By the harvest of '81, it was ready. I pulled it out of the shed and hooked on the 20-foot grain head. It looked ridiculous, this massive, ugly machine on my small farm. Earl drove by as I was making my first pass in the soybean field next to the road. He didn't laugh this time. He just slowed down and stared, a strange look on his face. He was seeing a ghost, a machine from a bygone era, brought back to life by sheer stubborn will. The beast, for all its faults, had an appetite. That Perkins V8 didn't sip fuel, it guzzled it. But it had torque like a locomotive. It could chew through the heaviest beans without slowing down. I sat in that cab, no air conditioning, the roar of the engine deafening, but I was harvesting my own crop with my own machine. And at the end of the day, when I shut it down, I didn't owe anyone a single dime for it. The grain prices were still high. I had a good year. So did Earl. He was on top of the world, buying another 40 acres. He told my neighbor he cleared over $100,000 that year. I cleared about $20,000. After I paid my property taxes, bought my seed and fertilizer for the next year, and put a little aside for Sarah and the kids, there wasn't much left. But what was left was ours. Earl's profit was just a number on a bank statement, a temporary stay against the massive principal he owed. I was content. I had my family, my farm, and my freedom. I thought I had weathered the storm. But as the fall of '81 turned into winter, a chill set in that had nothing to do with the weather. I'd listened to the news on the radio while I worked in the shed. A man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve was mentioned more and more. He was talking about fighting inflation. He was talking about raising interest rates. The numbers started to creep up. 12%, 15%, 18%. One afternoon, I ran into Earl at the parts store. He was complaining about the cost of a new set of tires for his Steiger. "Can you believe what they want for these things?" he grumbled. "Everything's going up," I said. "Yeah, well, so is the price of land," he shot back, his old confidence returning. "My banker just told me this place is worth twice what I paid for it. It's the best investment there is." He mentioned his operating loan, how the interest rate had jumped from 9 to 16%. "It's temporary," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "They'll bring 'em back down after the election. They have to." But I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. A tiny flicker of doubt. A shadow of fear. The foundation of his empire, built on the promise of cheap money and ever-rising prices, was starting to show cracks. And I stood on my own small patch of ground, solid and paid for, with a monster made of scrap iron and stubbornness waiting in my shed. The boom was ending. A quiet, cold reckoning was blowing in from the east, and I had a feeling that all the new paint and air-conditioned cabs in the world weren't going to be enough to stop it. The summer of 1982 was a furnace. The sky turned a pale, hazy white, and the sun beat down with a relentless fury. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high by the 4th of July, was stunted and yellow, its leaves curling in on themselves as if in prayer for a rain that never came. The ponds shrank, their edges cracking into intricate mosaics of dried mud, and the creek that cut through my south pasture dwindled to a trickle. Every morning I'd look at the western sky, searching for a cloud, and every morning it would be the same empty, brassy expanse. The drought was a slow, silent killer. It didn't have the drama of a tornado or a flood, but it was just as deadly. It choked the life out of the crops, and it squeezed the hope out of the men who farmed them. At the coffee shop, the talk grew grim. Yields were going to be half of normal, maybe less. For me, it was a punch to the gut. A bad year meant tightening the belt, putting off repairs, hoping for better next year. For Earl Peterson, it was the first tremor in the foundation of his empire. His whole operation was built on the assumption of massive yields and high prices. His loan payments were calculated on $3 corn, not the $1.75 it was hovering at now. He had to run his big machines over twice the acres just to stand still, and the drought was stealing those acres right out from under him. I saw him one afternoon, standing at the edge of one of his vast cornfields. He wasn't looking at the sky. He was staring at the ground, at the deep cracks in the earth, as if he could see his future crumbling in them. His new equipment, the pride of his fleet, began to betray him. Modern machinery was a marvel of efficiency, but it was also a labyrinth of complex systems. One sweltering day in August, one of his John Deere 7720s quit cold in the middle of his bean field. The engine would run, but the hydrostatic transmission wouldn't engage. He called the dealer, and the young mechanic came out with his truck full of diagnostic computers. They spent a whole day tracing wires and checking pressures. Finally, they found the problem. A tiny sealed electronic controller, a black box no bigger than a pack of cigarettes, had failed. The mechanic made some calls. "Bad news, Earl," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. That part's on back order. There's a strike at the factory in Dubuque. Might be 2 weeks, might be a month. A month. In the middle of harvest. Earl stood there, his face ashen. A month of payments on a machine that was nothing more than a $200,000 lawn ornament. He had to hire a custom operator to finish the field, paying a premium price that wiped out any hope of profit. I watched it all from a distance. The beast, my ugly, patched-together Massey, sat waiting in the shed. Its systems were simple, brutally so. If the hydraulics were weak, I could repack a cylinder. If the engine faltered, I could clean a fuel filter or adjust the timing myself. It had no black boxes, no computer chips. Its brain was a series of levers, belts, and gears, and I understood every single one of them. The drought had hit my crops just as hard. But when the time came to harvest what little there was, my machine would be ready, and the only person I had to rely on was myself. The first real crack in Earl's facade appeared in late September. He had a big note due at the bank, and the harvest income wasn't going to cover it. He had to sell off his herd of feeder calves 2 months early. He'd bought them high, banking on cheap corn to fatten them up. Now, with his own corn crop failing and feed prices skyrocketing, he had no choice. He sold them at a loss, a big one. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by a haunted, hunted look. He stopped coming to the coffee shop. The Lincoln Continental stayed in the garage. He drove his dusty farm truck everywhere, as if trying to appear smaller, less conspicuous. His kingdom was under siege, not by an invading army, but by the silent arithmetic of debt. The winter of '83 was long and brutal, but the real storm hit the following spring. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, in their war on inflation, had cranked interest rates to levels that were pure science fiction. 21%, the prime rate, the rate banks charged their best customers, was a number that had once been the territory of loan sharks. For farmers with operating loans, it was a death sentence. The news came over the radio like a funeral dirge. Land values, the bedrock on which the entire farm economy had been built, collapsed. An acre of prime Iowa farmland that had been worth $4,000 in 1981 was now struggling to fetch $1,500. Men who had thought they were millionaires on paper woke up to find they were bankrupt. The banks, which had been so eager to lend money just a few years before, now wanted it back. They started calling in the loans, their friendly local loan officers replaced by grim-faced men from Des Moines with briefcases full of foreclosure notices. It was a plague. Every week, it seemed, another white auction notice was nailed to a fence post along the county roads. Families who had farmed the same ground for 100 years were being put out on the street. The community was gripped by a quiet, desperate panic. Earl Peterson was caught in the perfect storm. He was leveraged to the absolute limit. His assets were suddenly worth less than half of what he owed. His variable rate loans, once his key to rapid expansion, were now a ticking time bomb. The interest alone on his debt was more than my entire farm would gross in a good year. The bank gave him 90 days. He tried everything. He tried to sell off some of the newer equipment, but the market was flooded. A 2-year-old combine was worth less than a third of what he'd paid for it. He tried to sell some land, but there were no buyers. Everyone was broke, and the banks weren't lending. He was trapped. I survived by being small. My costs were low. I had no debt payments. The 21% interest rate was just a scary number on the radio. It didn't touch me. Sarah's garden fed us through the summer. We canned enough tomatoes and beans to last the winter. I bartered my repair skills with the local mechanic for a new set of tires for the 4020. We didn't have much cash, but we were solvent. We were holding on. While my neighbors were drowning in a sea of red ink, I was standing on a small solid island I had built myself. The day of the Peterson auction was a grey, windswept day in early November, almost 10 years to the day after the Miller auction. The scene was sickeningly familiar, the same crowd of somber-faced neighbors, the same sharp-eyed bargain hunters, the same rhythmic chant of the auctioneer turning a man's life into cash. I stood at the back, just as I had before, but this time there was no anger, no resentment, only a profound, aching sadness. I watched Earl. He looked 10 years older. His Carhartt jacket was frayed at the cuffs. His face was a mask of exhausted defeat. He stood by his wife, who was clutching a handkerchief, her eyes fixed on the house she was about to lose. They sold his tools first. The big rolling toolbox, the welders, the socket sets. Then the machinery. The monster Steiger tractor, which had once seemed like the symbol of his power, sold for a fraction of its value to a corporate farm from out of state. The two gleaming John Deere 7720s, his pride and joy, went for less than the price of one. Each sold from the auctioneer was like a physical blow. Then they came to the land. They sold it off in parcels. The Henderson place, the Schmidt place, the Miller farm, the very land he had bought with such swagger and confidence was being stripped away from him. Finally, all that was left was the original 80 acres, the home place, the farm his father had started with after the war. The bidding on it was slow. No one wanted to be the one to take a man's home. The auctioneer worked the crowd, his voice pleading. The man from the bank stood with his arms crossed, his face impatient. I thought of Earl's words to me all those years ago. Get big or get out. He had gotten big, and now he was getting out. I thought of my father, of his stubborn belief in staying free and clear. I looked at my own calloused hands, hands that had rebuilt an engine, welded a grain tank, and fixed 100 things that were supposed to be unfixable. I felt a nudge in my side. It was Sarah. She had come to stand with me. She looked at the auction, then at me. Her eyes were full of a quiet understanding. You could do it, Jack, she whispered. I shook my head. We can't afford it. We can, she said, her voice firm. The money from the last 2 crops. We haven't touched it. It's not much, but it might be enough for this. I looked at her and then at the auctioneer. He was about to pass on the parcel. I thought of Earl's laughter that evening. He saw the beast in my yard. I thought of all the whispers, the pitying looks. A part of me, a dark, petty part, wanted to see him utterly broken. But that wasn't who my father had raised me to be. I raised my hand. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. I have a bid. The man from the bank looked over, surprised. A few neighbors turned to stare. The bidding went back and forth with a speculator from the city. My heart pounded in my chest. Each time I raised my hand, I was betting everything we had saved. I was betting the farm, but not on credit. I was betting it with cash, with 10 years of sweat and sacrifice. Sold, the auctioneer cried, his gavel falling with a crack that echoed across the silent yard. To Jack Callahan. A murmur went through the crowd. I felt dizzy. I had just bought the Peterson home place. I walked toward the clerk's table to sign the papers, my legs unsteady. As I passed Earl, he looked at me, his eyes filled with a confusing mix of shame, anger, and disbelief. He thought I had come to gloat, to deliver the final killing blow. He turned and walked away toward the barn, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I signed the papers and handed the clerk a cashier's check for the full amount. The banker looked at the check, then at me, a flicker of respect in his eyes. He was used to dealing with loan applications, not men who paid in full. After, I went looking for Earl. I found him in the empty machine shed, sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket, staring at the oil stains on the concrete floor where his tractors used to be. The place smelled of coal dust and failure. He didn't look up as I approached. "Come to kick me while I'm down, Callahan," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Come to enjoy the show?" "No, Earl," I said softly. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to say. The silence stretched between us, thick with the weight of a decade of rivalry and resentment. "I never wanted this for you," I finally said, "for any of my neighbors." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Right. You just wanted to be proven right." "Well, congratulations, Jack. You were right. Your junk heap is paid for, and my empire is being hauled away on flatbeds. You won." "This isn't a game," I said, my voice hardening slightly. "This is our life, our families, and it's not over." He looked up at me then, his eyes red-rimmed. "What are you talking about?" "It's over. I'm finished. I'll be lucky to get a job sweeping floors at the co-op." I took a deep breath. "I bought the home place, Earl. The house, the barns, this shed." His face tightened. "Yeah, I saw. Rub it in. Throw me off my own father's land." "I'm not throwing you off," I said. I pulled a piece of paper from my coat pocket. It was a rental agreement I'd had the lawyer draw up that morning. I'm going to rent it to you." He stared at me, uncomprehending. "Rent it? With what money, Jack? I don't have a penny to my name." "The rent," I said, holding out the paper, "is $1 a year. You and your family can stay in the house. You can use the machine shed. You can farm the 80 acres. All I ask is that you keep the place up." He looked from the paper to my face, searching for the trick, the angle. He found none. His hard expression began to crumble. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. For the first time, I saw the man behind the swagger, the scared farmer who had bet everything and lost. "Why?" he finally whispered, his voice cracking. "After everything, why would you do this?" "Because my dad taught me that you don't kick a man when he's down," I said. "And because this community is only as strong as its neighbors. You lost your way, Earl. You listened to the bankers instead of the land. But you're still a farmer. And your father was a good man. His place deserves to have a Peterson living on it." He took the paper from my hand, his own trembling. He stared at it, and then his shoulders began to shake. He put his head in his hands, and the sound of a grown man weeping filled the empty shed. I put a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of shared hardship, of a common bond that ran deeper than debt or profit. In that moment, we weren't rivals anymore. We were just two Iowa farmers, survivors of a storm that had washed so many others away. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis had scoured the countryside, but those of us who were left were tougher, wiser. The talk in the coffee shop changed. It wasn't about who had the newest, biggest equipment anymore. It was about who could make a bearing last another season, who had found a cheap source for parts, who had gotten the best price for their oats. My advice, once ignored, was now sought after. Men would bring me broken parts from their old machines, and I'd show them how to weld them, how to make do, how to keep going without writing a check to the dealer. Earl became a different man. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He worked the 80 acres with a small used tractor he'd managed to buy. He got a job driving a truck for the co-op to make ends meet. He and I never became close friends, but a deep, unspoken respect grew between us. Every year on the 1st of November, he'd come to my door with a crisp dollar bill for the rent, and we'd share a cup of coffee and talk about the weather. My own son, Tom, grew up with grease under his fingernails. He learned to drive on the old 4020. He spent his teenage summers helping me maintain the beast, which I kept running for another 15 years before finally retiring it. It never looked pretty, but it never failed to bring in the crop. We parked it out by the machine shed, a monument of rust and red primer, a reminder of a desperate gamble that had paid off. One evening, when Tom was in his early 20s and starting to take over more of the farm, he came into the kitchen and laid a glossy brochure on the table. On the cover was a brand new, gleaming green combine. It had GPS steering, a yield monitor, and a cab that looked more comfortable than my living room. "Dad," he said, his eyes shining with excitement, "look at this. It can harvest 12 rows at a time. We could get our crop done in half the time." I looked at the brochure, at the incredible machine, and the even more incredible price tag at the bottom. I looked at my son, seeing the same ambition, the same desire for progress that had once driven Earl Peterson. I didn't get angry. I didn't forbid it. I just nodded slowly. "It's a fine machine, son, a real marvel." I got up and poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the table to him. "Debt is a tool, Tom," I said, my voice quiet. "Not a lifestyle. It's like a shovel. You can use it to dig a foundation for something great, or you can use it to dig your own grave. The trick is knowing the difference. And the most important thing a man can learn is when to put the shovel down." I looked out the kitchen window, across the yard to the grove where the setting sun was glinting off the faded paint of the old Massey Ferguson. "That machine out there," I said, "it's ugly, it's loud, it's inefficient. But it's honest. It never promised me anything it couldn't deliver, and it never asked for anything I couldn't give. We didn't get big, son. We didn't conquer the world. But we're still here. Our name is on the mailbox. The land is ours. And in the end, that's a better kind of wealth than any banker can ever put on paper." Tom looked out the window with me, at the silhouette of the junkyard giant against the twilight sky. He was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up the glossy brochure, folded it once, and laid it aside. He picked up his coffee cup and took a slow sip, a thoughtful, knowing look in his eyes. He was beginning to understand. The legacy wasn't just in the land, it was in the lesson.